How's it going, everyone? It is me, Lone Bot Wanderer, here with a video idea that I thought about doing over the past couple of months as I've been producing other Fallout discussion videos, which have done really well on my channel, and I honestly want to thank all of you for that. And essentially, the idea is looking on the biggest changes that BGS made to the Fallout franchise when you're looking from Fallout 3 in New Vegas to Fallout 4, and seeing if we can think of the pros and the cons for each of those major changes. And as you can tell with the title of this video, we are going to be talking about the addition of a voice protagonist in Fallout 4, and asking the questions: 1. What were the pros of adding a voice protagonist to Fallout 4? And second, what were the cons or the negatives of adding a voice protagonist to Fallout 4? And I think it's going to be an interesting thought experiment to kind of look at this addition, this major change to the Fallout franchise, in that kind of neutral or unbiased way, because I'm sure many of you do have a very hard stance or line when it comes to the addition of the voice protagonist in Fallout 4. And I'm also going to assume that most of you simply just did not want to have a voice protagonist in that game, and I completely understand that. Don't get me wrong, I actually do. But because of that, because of a lot of people having that hard stance, I think it's going to be interesting to try and challenge people to see if they can think of actual benefits of having a voice protagonist in the game, and then of course still thinking of the cons with regards to adding a voice protagonist to the Fallout franchise or to a Fallout game. And to just start the discussion, I'm going to be simply listing 2 pros and 2 cons to having a voice protagonist in the Fallout franchise, and of course we're going to be using Fallout 4 as a litmus test or as an example here. But I'm going to put to all of you, I'm going to challenge all of you to see if you can think of both pros and cons, positives and negatives in that regard. I'm not going to ask all of you to think of equal cons and equal pros, because I'm just doing that on my side to try and be unbiased and neutral and all of that stuff. But go nuts. If you think there are 10 cons and 0 pros, then list those 10 cons and don't mention anything about there being pros or benefits. If you want to try and challenge yourself and think of equal pros and cons, then feel free to do that in the comments below. But before I get into my specific pros and cons, I will say at the outset that if you look back on my Fallout 5 should return to its roots video, I'm certainly of the opinion that the next Fallout game should not have a voice protagonist. I've said that it's a major change that happened to the franchise, along so many other major changes, that it kind of altered the dial too much in terms of change and innovation, quote unquote, if you will. It just made too many changes to the Fallout franchise where I can very well see to many people, even including myself, that the game did not feel as Fallout as it probably should have, or as past Fallout games have. And that's me saying that even though I did actually like the voice protagonist in the game, I myself have only experienced the male protagonist that was done by Brian T. Delaney, but I have seen snippets, of course, of the female protagonist by Courtney Taylor. And the actual quality of their voice acting, I don't think can really be criticized. I think they did a great job with the actual voice acting. But the actual question is not whether they did a good job, but whether it should have been there in the first place. So I know I straddle both sides of the fence there, and usually that's what I do in my videos anyways. I try and be neutral and unbiased. But regardless, I'm going to put aside those predispositions, and I'm going to try and think of 2 pros of having a voice protagonist and 2 cons of having a voice protagonist in the Fallout franchise, using Fallout 4 as an example. So we're going to start with a pro and then go to a con and then alternate in that regard. The first pro: having a voice protagonist in Fallout 4 really did allow the story to be much more emotional. Because the entire premise of the story was you losing your partner, whether you're a male or a female, it was either your wife or your husband. You watched your partner get killed in front of your eyes, and then you saw your son get taken away. And throughout the entire game, you wake up in this kind of alternate dystopian world, if you will, after all the bombs fell, not really recognizing your home anymore because it's been so destroyed and so demolished, and not knowing where your child is, not knowing where your son is. That in and of itself, while it might be a kind of a cliche story, is still meant to be an emotive story at heart. And having a voice protagonist allows those emotions to come through to the actual player, to the gamer, whether myself or yourself, much more than it ever could by having a silent protagonist where you're just reading words on a screen. When you're listening to the protagonist talk about his son Sean and asking people around the wasteland, "Where is my son? I'm looking for my son," you can hear the emotion in his voice or her voice. You can hear the passion in his or her voice. You can hear the tone, the inflection, the anger, the sadness, the depression. All of those emotions come through so much more effectively simply because there is a voice protagonist. Because after all, having a voice protagonist means having an actual human, a real human that we can empathize with that's voicing that character. And because of that, we can more understand how angry they are, how sad they are because they lost their son, how angry they are getting because they're not finding the truth. And that's just not in regards to that storyline, but look at any side quest or any other character interaction with any faction or other NPCs in the Wasteland. But those discussions and those conversations become so much more emotive and passionate when there's a voice protagonist there. It adds that subtlety and it adds that inflection that would simply not be there if there was no voice protagonist. So that's the very first pro that I'll mention. But now let's move on to a con. The very first and I think the biggest con with having a voice protagonist in Fallout is that it doesn't allow you as the player or the gamer to portray your own voice and your own personality onto that character. In other words, to project yourself onto the main protagonist. Because let's be honest, when you play Fallout 3 and when you play Fallout New Vegas, when you're reading the text on the screen and there's no voice protagonist there, you're able to envision your own voice speaking those words because there's nothing else to distract that. You're able to truly imagine yourself being in the shoes of the protagonist because there is no voice getting in the way. And because of that, you have so many untold benefits. One, it really adds to role playing. If you want to role play as a specific character, especially in additional playthroughs where you might want to change it up, having a silent protagonist actually allows you to do that so much more effectively. You're able to project yourself onto that protagonist in a way that makes you feel like you are him or her. When there is a pre-established voice that's coming from the mouth of this character, instantly you can't feel like you're him or her. Instantly, it feels like you are playing another character that is actually not you. Take any other RPG or open world game that has a main character that has a pre-established background and a pre-established story with their own voice, protagonist. For example, Witcher 3 and Geralt. You can't get past the fact that when you're playing that game, it might be a great game, but you're playing as a pre-established, as a predetermined character. When there is a voice there, that instantly means that you cannot play as yourself. When there is someone else's voice there, some other man's or some other woman's voice, that instantly means that character is simply not you. It can't possibly be. And because of that, some people find that disconnect hard in terms of trying to play the game as if they were the character themselves. It's just not possible. It's not possible when you don't have a silent protagonist. Yes, some games are different in that regard. For example, Zelda. When you play Zelda, even though Link is a silent protagonist, he might grunt here or there. But still, Link, even though as a silent protagonist, he is a predetermined character. We all know Link, we all know his backstory, we all know who he is. We don't pretend to be Link as we play the game, or substitute our own personality or identity into Link as we play Zelda. But with Fallout, you are creating this character from the ground up, with his or her own name, with their own facial look and traits and bone structure and muscle and height, weight, everything about that character you are custom creating from the ground up. So that game is built on the premise of you making the character who you want to be. And whether you're role-playing a different character or being yourself, it's a weird dissonance when suddenly that character is voiced by someone else. How can you create your own character or a certain character that you want to play as, and then not be able to envision your own voice into that character? There's a weird disconnect there. So that's the first con that I'll mention. Now, the second positive that I'll say with having a voice protagonist is that I don't know what it was, but when listening and looking at the conversations that were taking place, I kind of liked the fact that I could sit back, relax, and just watch these conversations play out. Whereas with Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, there was a lot of reading that had to be done when you had to look at all of the dialogue options. Click on the option that you wanted to, hear the other character's response, then read, click on the option, rinse and repeat. With Fallout 4, I'd like just sitting back and just viewing a conversation as it plays out naturally, as it would in real life. I'm not necessarily saying that when you have a silent protagonist, that does not mean that the actual character in the game isn't talking. The character is technically talking. You just can't hear it when it's a silent protagonist. They are actually speaking the words that you're clicking on when you make that dialogue choice. It's just that you can't hear it. But what I am saying is that I really liked seeing the back and forth between the protagonist and the characters in the Wasteland. It made those conversations feel much more relatable. In my opinion, it made the conversations feel much more enjoyable. I actually liked sitting back and hearing the dialogue play out as it did. You know, when there were jokes made, when there were emotional bits, when there was something distressing going on, when someone was calling out for help, all of that kind of back and forth. It felt more real, if you will, like how a conversation would actually take place in the real world, you know what I mean? Even though we are playing a video game, I guess it's just a small preference that I liked. I just think that generally it made the game flow a little better, it made the conversations a little bit more enjoyable, and let the story and the conversations just play out much more smoothly than it would have if it was just a silent protagonist. I know some people might disagree with that, but I just enjoyed the actual conversations and the content of the conversations more because there were two humans talking to each other, like actually speaking to one another, instead of just one person not saying anything and an NPC shouting words at you. While I'm not saying that the latter is not enjoyable, I'm saying that I just enjoyed the previous one a little bit more. Maybe by a small amount, but it's there. Alrighty, and the second con and the final point of this video. Having a voice protagonist very clearly limited the actual physical number of dialogue options in each conversation. When you look at Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, think back to some of the conversations where you had anywhere from 2 to like 8 or even like 10 dialogue options in every single conversation. And that was actually possible because they were just text, you know? You didn't have to have a voice actor speak out every one of those lines to be able to include them in a conversation. And because Fallout 4 had a voice protagonist, that is certainly the reason why every speech dialogue point had 4 options. I don't believe there was any other reason behind that design choice other than just to make it easier on BGS to 1, have a voice actor voice those lines, and 2, to get those lines into the game and to ensure they covered all their bases. I strongly believe that that 4 dialogue option premise was only there because of the voice protagonist, just to make it easier for BGS. But unfortunately, because of that, even though I enjoyed conversations more, it did mean, well, you only have 4 options at every speech point. Why do I only have 4 options? That doesn't make sense. When you go back to Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, there were so many more options that you could choose from. Some that were very subtle, some that had jokes, some that were negative. But with Fallout 4, it's just, nah, 4 at every point, here you go. And that was just really weird, especially as a Fallout game that typically had a lot of voice dialogue. I mean, wasn't New Vegas like awarded a prize for having the most voice dialogue in a game generally? I believe that was the case. You know what? I'm going to Google it. Yep, there you go. New Vegas held the Guinness World Record for the most lines of dialogue in a game. And do you know how that was facilitated? Because they didn't have a voice protagonist. Because they didn't have to have a voice actor voice every single line, which takes time to do in the first place. It costs money, and then it takes even more time to add into the game. And what if mistakes are made? What if BGS wants to make changes? They have to get the voice actor back in to voice those lines again. But when you have a silent protagonist, the developer can literally make changes right up until the game is released. If they're not happy with a line of dialogue, they can go, alright, let's backspace, edit that line, let's add another one, let's add another 2 because we think it makes sense. There is not that roadblock where, fuck, if we want to make changes to the lines of dialogue that the protagonist speaks, or add something new or add more, whatever it is, you can't do that as easily when there is a voice protagonist. But when there's a silent protagonist, there is nothing stopping BGS from having like 10, 20, however many dialogue options that they want at each particular speech point, and change them as they go. Make them as long as they want. Make them as weird or as wacky as they really want to. That's one of the true benefits of having a silent protagonist. You're not restricted in that regard. And if we did have a silent protagonist in Fallout 4, I can almost guarantee you, we also would not have had 1, 4 dialogue options at every speech point. And also 2, I really doubt that we would have had the kind of summarized voice options that we did in Fallout 4. Because when there's no voice protagonist, there's no option to just show a summarized version because we know that the protagonist is going to be speaking the full text in full. When you don't have that voice protagonist there, you have to show all the text in absolute full in order for players to actually understand what's going on. You can't have a summarized version with a silent protagonist because it wouldn't make sense. Like, it wouldn't make sense when you're having this deep and meaningful conversation when there's no voice protagonist to just read like, yes, okay, maybe, or I like that. No, that's not how conversations take place. If there was a silent protagonist, you have to have the full text of dialogue for every option shown to you in full. And again, that's another restriction that having a voice protagonist has. So anyway, Sway Sanders, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to see what you think in terms of the pros and cons of having a voice protagonist in Fallout 4. Let me know. And until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourself, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.